I saw some of the programs, but outside. I didn't have this. Okay. Just one second. I want to know if all the PhD students are in this, or
So invite was
Yes.
sent to most.
okay.
Yes, the entire MPhil PhD people get the invite.
Okay, great.
So,
Yeah. So, like, what's her name? Pallavi Das. Is she around? She's one who works on cholera. So I thought maybe.
No, not yet, sir.
Okay, okay.
no idea.
Hi, Razi. Okay.
Are we good to go?
Yes.
All right. Just 1 second. I'll start the broadcast.
Is Chinmay there now?
Yeah. All right. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all on the behalf of the Seminar Committee, Department of History, University of Delhi, for a special talk by Dr. Chinmay Tumbe on migration and pandemics. Dr. Tumbe is the author of India Moving, A History of Migration, and The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World. Presently, he is with the Department of Economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He holds a master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a doctorate from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He was the Jean Monnet postdoctoral fellow at the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute in Florence, Italy, in 2013, and was with the School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, in 2014 to 2016. He has worked in academic, corporate, and government institutions in India, UK, and Italy, served on an interministerial working group on migration, and his research has been featured in journals, newspapers, and policy portals. His research interests include migration studies, urban economics, and business and economic history. Today's talk will be chaired by Professor Prabhu Mohapatra of the Department of History. Over to Professor Mohapatra.
Hello. Good afternoon and welcome. I welcome all of you who are in the Zoom meeting and also who are watching the live streaming of this occasion. We are really honored and privileged to have Dr. Chinmay Tumbe speaking to us. Chinmay Tumbe's introduction, perhaps Abhijit has already done, but I would like to say how crucial, how important has been his work for forefronting, on the one hand, migration, and he was part of one of the most important policy group on interministerial group on migration. The report of that is perhaps should be taught to all economic history or economics students. It's so well written and well meticulously written. And Chinmay Tumbe's, but the most important thing that he managed to write managed to write the book, The Age of Pandemic, 1817 to 1920, while being quarantined or whatever, within the lockdown period. It's a feat of academic, real feat of academic, what you say, academic adventure and entrepreneurship, the way he could manage and get documentation worldwide in order to chart the story of pandemic and to remind, as he says, that those who forget the lessons of the past are condemned to repeat it in some sense. So even though we are still within the pandemic thing, it's it's very important. Chinmay's book, both the books are in some ways interconnected. The earlier India Moving was about the internal migration of Indian, the history of migration, internal migration in India. And as it happens, the age of pandemic, 1817 to 1920, also happens to be called the age of migration. In roughly the same period, it's called the age of migration. 1840 to 1920s is the name of a very famous book by Jeffrey Williamson called The Age of Migration. So here we have Chinmay going to speak to us about migration and pandemic, with very much many of our students and ourselves personally witnessed to, and in some ways also connected to, the massive exodus. And Chinmay is one of the persons whose calculation about the number of people possibly who could have gone. He roughly says about 3 million people could have, 30 million, nearly 3 crore people could have moved during this exodus. And that remains, I think, still the best estimate that we have of the number of people who left their workplaces to return to their home. Now, with this in my mind, I once again, I'm very happy to have Chinmay Tumbe speak to us, to our students, and we look forward to hearing. Okay, over to you, Chinmay. I think you'll speak for about 45 minutes. Is that about?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Chinmay.
Great. Thank you so much, Prabhu. It's an absolute honor and privilege to speak, in the history seminar at Delhi University. I have learned tremendously from the faculty, though I have never been to the department or formally interacted. I am, after all, a trained economist, not a trained historian. But in the past decade, I wrote my PhD on migration history. So I can describe myself as a self-taught historian who gone and done the hard work of sitting in archives, which is probably the classic hallmark of a person who engages in history. And the one thing I'm really proud of is setting up an archive, the IMA archive, which I think has the best digital presence in India right now. We've put a ton of content online, so do have a look at it. It's called the IMA archives. I should also give you a backdrop that you might be thinking, how does a person from IIM Ahmedabad, come and talk on history? IIM Ahmedabad is also the pioneer of business history. It was here where Professor Dwijendra Tripathi practiced his art for over 25 years, from 1964, when he was inducted, to 1990, when he retired. And he wrote the Oxford History of Indian Business, which is still, in a way, the classic on that in his retirement. He was also the president of the Indian History Congress and so on. So there is also a legacy. And in a way, what I'm trying to do here is build forward that legacy of Professor Dwijendra Tripathi. Now, my work over the past decade has been mostly on migration, in which I had, I read a lot on different aspects of migration, internal, international, current, past, read a lot of Prabhu's work, read a lot, I found out recently that I had cited Santosh's work in my book. I got to know Santosh only a few weeks back at the conference, at the history conference that we organize at IMA every 2 years. But fantastic work. And I'm looking forward to reading the book, which I've just got, called Weaving Hierarchies. So my first book on migration took about 10 years to write, in the sense of research and so on. And as Prabhu said, the second book has literally taken 10 months, which is, not my usual time, or not any researcher's time to write a book, but it was kind of forced upon by circumstances. And that circumstance includes roughly in March 2020, when the first talk of the pandemic started, even before the national lockdown, I felt a kind of strange sense of discomfort with the kind of conversations going around. A, people said pandemics have never hit India in the past. Why are we so bothered about this thing? B, we can eat pani puris on the street. We have natural immunity. All these foreigners are complaining because nothing can happen to us. There was this bizarre sense of innate immunity, which keeps Indians at bay from deadly diseases. It's okay. I mean, people know that, there's morbidity, there's malaria, there's all these other diseases, but for some reason, pandemic disease, we are, immune to. I mean, these were real conversations, and they were filtering onto the op-ed pieces of, newspapers saying, oh, nothing happened to us during, MERS, nothing happened to us during SARS, why are we overreacting and so on. And I, for some reason, because of this work on migration, knew intuitively that whenever I read about migration history, you invariably come across epidemics. Because as I'm going to present, one of the stylized facts is that this whole urge to return home and so on, as we saw last year, this sense that a pandemic crisis often is also a migration crisis. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. It's kind of a combination of, the two books, but it's actually about the current book on pandemics. But it's to give you a sense about how closely pandemics are related with migration, right? And the starting point today is that, of course, you can't have a pandemic without some migration. In the sense, when you think about it, how does a disease spread from one part of the world to another? It's not typically atmospheric dispersion. It is typically a human being going to the other place, which means that to curtail a pandemic, you also do need to curtail mobility. It's a no-brainer. But how do you do it? When do you do it? These are burning public policy questions. And we've seen this play out, in the last year, very, very cruelly in some aspects in India. But it's been a question that policymakers are, really, really keen on trying to, crack. It's a very tough nut to crack. Lives versus livelihoods. All of us have seen. All of us, I think, have gone through these emotions in the past 1.5 years. We first say, "Oh, no, let's do the lockdown." And then the lockdown gets too much. Say, "Oh no, enough is enough. Let's start going." These are natural, emotions. And of course, we've seen this in the past as well. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was that I just felt that there was a lot to learn. This is a cliche. People who do history, you can learn from history and stuff like that. But especially in this pandemic, I do think many lives would have been saved. Many things could have been done differently if only we had kind of, learned really from the pandemic. And the other reason, I wrote this book was, barring, say, David Arnold's, monumental work on cholera and plague in the 19th century. And of course, there have been, scholars who work in this field of medical history who have written a lot. One of the things I'm going to show you is a bibliography of about 250 studies on Indian pandemics, let's call it. I'll talk about that in a bit. And David Arnold has probably done more than any other historian in this field, followed by maybe Mridula Ramana and a few others in this particular 19th century context. But one, I thought, that scholarship is also about 20, 30 years old. And two, nobody's really written on the influenza. And the influenza is the big one. It's the really biggie. 1918, what sometimes is called the Spanish flu, that killed more Indians than everyone who died in World War I globally. Right? When you start seeing these numbers, it really kind of hits you, saying how is it that it's not really there in the public consciousness? And so that's what really motivated me to get into this project headlong. Some idea on migration in the past and so on. In terms of sources used for this book, one of the reasons I went ahead with this book project was because I very quickly realized that a lot of it is actually doable sitting at home. Because I was sitting at home and doing the research for this book. That's because two fantastic data sources exist. One is the Wellcome, collection. They've digitized tons of these old medical reports, a huge collection, and it's completely freely available online. It's just a tremendous public good to have. And the second is the National Library of Scotland, Edinburgh, which has got a particular sub-page on medical history of British India. So these two collections, digitized, were tremendous sources to get the basics of. And in my own work on economic history in the past, I had digitized a lot of these death statistics and stuff like that for my work. I had never really used them, but I realized that I was sitting on pre-core things. I had access sitting, in my room in Ahmedabad. I had digital access to a lot of documents, and I had also access to all the statistical evidence in terms of knowing which years were the big years, which provinces were more affected, which districts. So I felt like I could do this project, and I thought I should do it in 2020 itself because, the pandemic was really topical. So that's really how I got into this in full. The one thing I did not really have access to was, of course, personal memoirs and stuff like that. And so obviously, if I'd spent 3-4 more years, I would have got much more of the personal story in it. Having said that, I chanced upon amazing memoirs. For example, Lakshmibai Tilak's, Smriti Chitre, which has detailed chapters on not only plague, but also the influenza, which is not called influenza in, that part of Maharashtra. It was called Man Modi. But basically what she was describing was the 1918 influenza. So I also stumbled upon, a lot of things, and they were sitting on my shelf literally. And, these were chance discoveries. It so happened that just before the lockdown, I was in Calcutta, outside South Park Street Cemetery. And like any good trained economist, when you look at numbers, you tend to buy that book. And they had a burial record book being sold at the counter of the cemetery. And so I bought that book. And this 2 days before the lockdown, I had not made up my mind to write this book. And so what I did was to digitize that. And so what you have now is the first, probably the earliest, time series of deaths in India, because the British time series on deaths really starts from the 1860s, whereas this South Park Street time series starts from 1780s to 1860s. And you can clearly see that 1817 is when it starts, it explodes. And that's why this book starts off in 1817, the year of a very virulent strain of cholera outbreak, and it ends at 1920, because 1920 is, 1918, 1920 is this influenza outbreak. But death rates in India, if you see a chart, start falling every decade onwards thereafter. So 1920 is a convenient breakpoint in our demographic history in terms of how our population starts to increase consistently after that, because death rates start falling. And 1817 is a starting point because of this unusually wide outbreak of cholera. So that's the kind of time period I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to kind of juxtapose some of that with, of course, what we're seeing today. But my focus, there are thousands of things one can talk about pandemics. My focus out here is going to be migration, right? And so that's what I'm really going to focus on. So I'm going to have a few slides. Feel free to stop me at any point or ask questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end as well. All right. So, this is, the cover page of the two books I've written so far, The Age of Pandemics. And I want you to see the images carefully, because in a way, both the images played out on our screens in the last 2 years, right? The first image, of course, is of people trying to, go from point A to point B, which is the quintessential photograph of Indian migration, which is people trying to get onto a train, literally, not just inside a train, but on a train. And I'll talk about the significance of the Indian railways and so on in just a bit. But we saw, of course, we saw the Shramik trains last year, which were arranged and so on. And the other is about surveillance, and we saw a lot of shocking images last year of, let's say, a lot of power given to the Indian police under the Epidemic Disease Act and so on. That particular image is from Bombay City during the plague. And it's a particular image of, people trying to, literally, spraying disinfectants on a building. And I'm going to start with that image because that image is very powerful. It not only tells you about what the British are trying to do, but it also tells you that on hindsight, this was roughly 1898, that picture, on hindsight, what they're doing in that picture actually has no bearing on plague prevention, in the sense that, by disinfecting, by pouring some water on buildings, that's not how plague gets eradicated. And so a very important part of understanding pandemics is that you have to invest a lot in understanding transmission. And initially we're all groping in the dark. I'm sure many of us last year, somebody said surface transmission, and then every parcel which came home, I remember my mother, she would vet everything that came home many times, literally give a bath to every parcel, which came home. We now know that surface transmission is virtually, a non-negligible factor in COVID transmission. It's pretty much airborne. It's a complete, that learning has taken 1 year, right? But we all grope, and this is pretty much the British groping with complete uncertainty in 1898 or so. It's only by 1910 that they figured out what really happens in. So let me start with the image from our times. When we talk about migration and pandemics, the word crisis comes about, because what you see in this image, this is an image from last year. It was taken by Danish Siddiqui, who unfortunately passed away a few months back in Afghanistan. It's a very shocking image of a person walking, literally trying to walk back home with a child on top. And this other image, which is also on your screen, is from almost 124 years or 23 years back during the plague. It's from the Illustrated London News, 6th February 1897. It's the same month, by the way, in which the Epidemic Disease Act was passed. And it says the pandemic plague in India, right? The exodus from Bombay. The word pandemic is not used in the subtitle of the thing, so that's my word, but it's basically about plague exodus, right? And I want you to just look at these two images for a while, because you kind of see the same sense of desperation to go back. There's a lot of anxiety. You'll also see this image in the chart on the left, the woman holding the child, in this case, the man holding the child. And this idea that you have to get back from the city to the village. Right? And it's a very powerful theme. And I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to end this presentation coming back to these images about how this could have played out so very differently. Of course, you can see that one big difference out here is that you can see the train on one side and you don't see the train on the other side. And that's a big part of the difference. about what we are. But I'll come back to this because this is the burning public policy question. What do you do with migrants in a pandemic, especially if epidemiologically speaking, migration does lead to pandemics, right? And so obviously the question is not about should we stop? Yes, we have to curtail migration, but how, when? As I said, it's the nitty-gritties of public policy which matter in this. And there is a lot of learning from the past on this particular aspect. I just also go through about pandemics in general. This is, how we see the reported, and I put reported in quotes because I have a paper with my colleagues now on estimating COVID deaths in India. And I can tell you it's not 440,000 what the government is saying. Our estimates are that 3 million people have died in the pandemic so far. That paper is now under review at a journal. But the point out here is to show you that pandemics come in waves. And we've seen that in the 3 devastating pandemics of the past. Right? And this is using the death statistics from British sources: cholera, plague, and influenza. Right now, the different time scales. Cholera, I'm showing you from 1875 to roughly 1930s. You see, it kind of dips after 1920s, and that's also one of the reasons why my book kind of ends at 1920. Cholera was, of course, very high during famine periods. Cholera, we now know, is a waterborne disease. For a long time, the British consistently argued that it was an airborne disease in India. But the death rates were fairly high, 3 per 1,000, and then they kind of fall. Plague, you see, was even more devastating than cholera. Cholera, by the way, starts in 1817, but we don't have that time series. We have the time series only from 1870. Plague, you'll see, a lot of the plague literature, when I was reading the literature on plague, I realized a kind of strange inconsistency. A huge part of the literature on plague in India focuses on this very interesting in terms of political history of period of, say, 1896 to 1902. Right? Why? Because this is when, the Walter Rand was assassinated in Pune. This is all about the extreme surveillance. When you look at the time series, just look at 1896 to 1900. There's virtually no plague then in the sense of actual numbers. Plague really ripped through India in 1907, where more than 1 million people died, right? And it's really between 1905 and 1920 that plague is really a huge part of the story. So there's actually, when you look at the literature on plague in India, I do see this. Much of the literature is focused on the early part of the plague, when in theory, actually, it did not really kill too many people, right? And when it actually killed a lot of people, surprisingly, the literature gets hidden. There's another year, 1924, but again, you'll see that 1920 is a kind of a break point, after which it moves out. And influenza is the most devastating of them all. It kills many more people than cholera and plague combined. And it plays out over pretty much a year in 2 devastating waves. You'll see the first wave is in April and May. It's almost identical to what happened in COVID in terms of the second wave being completely devastating. As some have said, flattening the curve along the y-axis rather than the x-axis. You can see how steep the second wave can. And I show this again to show you that, to make this obvious point, which seems to be on hindsight now in India, that pandemics come in waves, right? That is, it is not that, you just get a one-off shock. And throughout last year, especially between Jan and March early this year, I think the government of India and a lot of people in public policy went into a very strange kind of hubris mode, where the pandemic was over and, we have, as the health minister said, we are in the end game of the pandemic and so on. And then came the second wave and completely knocked us over in April, May, June next year. Right? Now, the reason I show this also is because when you start thinking about migration and migrants, you can't just have a one-off plan. You need to understand that migrants, especially in India, when so many people, travel back and forth from village to city, that you need to have a forward-looking plan, assuming that pandemics will come in waves, and that hence you need to have a very robust plan. So it's not like one-off. That's the second thing that pandemics tell you from the past, that pandemics come in waves, and you have to be prepared for a considerable amount of time. Right? Now, nobody knows when the corona pandemic is going to get over. Multiple kind of ways to look at it. But there's no doubt that of the complacency that we showed in India in Jan, Feb, March earlier this year, when clearly, the worst was not behind us at that point. So in my book, I focus on 3 pandemics: cholera, plague, and influenza. They are very different diseases. Cholera and plague, we now know, are bacteria-based diseases. When influenza struck, by the way, they thought it was bacteria-based. We now know it's a virus. But so obviously, the science on these diseases progressed so much over time. I'm not going to talk about the science behind the disease. There's considerable literature on that. I look at 1920 as the terminal date, not because they magically disappear after that, but considerably the death rates start falling. And the numbers are stark. India was the most affected country in absolute terms in each of those three pandemics, right? And note, by this time, smallpox is not really considered a pandemic. And I can show you death rate charts on smallpox. It's by 1870s, 1880s, smallpox is no longer a very dangerous disease in India. Right? Of course, the eradication takes place only the late 20th century, but it's smallpox is a crazy disease before 1850s, so to speak. But in this time period, these diseases reign supreme. I should also say that the disease which killed most Indians in this time period was not either of these three, but malaria. Right? So malaria has always, in some sense, been the king of all diseases in the world, maybe. But malaria is not classified as a pandemic. Right? And so what is a pandemic? We say pandemic is basically something which goes around the world simultaneously. Right? So that's the definition. And in those times, they didn't call it pandemics. Influenza was called a pandemic. The word pandemic comes into official Indian government reports, arguably for the first time in 1919, when Norman White wrote a preliminary report on the influenza pandemic in India. But before that, they were all called epidemics, though the Hindi word Mahamari was often used in British reports. For example, in 1850s, there was one in Dehradun, which was referring to the plague in Dehradun. So when I say plague in 1894, I'm really talking about the plague which emerges in Bombay. But it's not the case that plague was not there in India before 1894. In fact, the city I'm based in now, Ahmedabad, had a plague outbreak in the early 19th century as well. Similarly, cholera was not new to India in 1817. We're saying it was much more virulent. There was an influenza outbreak in the 1890s. In fact, when influenza came in 1918, people said, "Oh, it's just a repeat of what happened in 1891." In the initial phase. This is to give you a big kind of overview of this period that we're talking about. India being the most affected country. And that's, if nothing, this is one reason why we need to be concerned about pandemics in India. And the numbers overall are very large. 40 million is not a joke. And that 20 million, by the way, influenza estimate, that was about 6% of India's population wiped out in the matter of a few months. That is India's worst demographic shock ever. And I've argued in the book that that's one of the reasons India's labor movement really sparks up. In a strange way, capital labor relations change after that. Now, many of these figures, many of the literature that I'm referring to, it's all there in a 90-page supplement to the book, which is called Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India. It's freely available. So if there's any of you working on pandemics, there's a ready-made bibliography for you. It's there. It's freely available online that provides tons of time series on variety of disease, not just this, also smallpox, diarrhea, dysentery, variety of disease. And it gives you an extended bibliography beyond what is there in my book. Right. So this is the document you should be really going to if you're doing research, and it's freely available online. You just have to Google. Coming to today's figures, India is also now the #1 affected country in COVID. You might not see that in the reported numbers, where India is ranked 2 or 3, after US and Brazil, but there's no doubt whatsoever that by now India is the most affected country in absolute terms, and it's very high even on per capita terms, right? Which means we are doing as badly as US, UK, and many Latin American countries, though not as bad as some of them. We're saying it's about 2,000 COVID deaths per million. That's where we are. We are not at, which is a number which is much more than 300 per million, which is what, if you go by the reported numbers. So if you look at the reported COVID deaths today, we are saying 5 million people have died globally, of which 500,000 people have died in India. But we now know from a variety of studies around the world that the actual numbers are supposed to be much more than 10 million globally. And the India number is about 3 million. And that 3 million number is coming from our work, which is currently under review. It uses multiple databases to estimate that. So here's the thing, the age of pandemics and COVID, unfortunately, India has been the most affected country, right? In absolute terms, and also in per capita terms in COVID, we are unfortunately right now, right? And so in this context, of course, migrant workers and migrants in particular demand special attention. The other thing to note about pandemic is about the economic cost, right? And this is a chart on economic growth on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis. And each dot represents a year of Indian history. And you'll see that the worst year of Indian history was a pandemic year, 1918. In 1918, growth fell by 10%. Growth was minus 10%. And inflation as measured by the GDP deflator was about 30%. So 1918 was your classic supply side shock to the Indian economy, right? World War II, 1942, 43 had high inflation. But 2020, interestingly, is also a year in which the Indian economy contracted by about 8%. Now, what's really interesting is that the two worst years of Indian economic history have both been pandemic years. And when the going gets really tough in the economy, one of the constituencies or one of the segments of the labor market most affected is migrant workers. Right? And so one way to look at history and the contemporary scenario is that migrant workers have had it really bad in pandemic years, both in the past as well as in the present. And in a way, 1918 and 2021 have been horrific years. They've been horrific years for all of us, but they've been particularly bad for migrant workers. Okay, I'm just going to skip over this. This is, these are charts. The chart on the left is in my working paper. It gives you a sense of how bad these pandemics were compared to the famines, right? Because the other big part about Indian history of 19th century is famines. There is also a good point to be made that many of the people who died in famines were dying of cholera, for example. So how do you disentangle the pandemic and the famine? But you can have some estimates on that. And so if you see the numbers, the great, the famine of 1876, 78, 5 to 8 million and so on. But the influenza is on top of all of that. The plague is also on top of all of that. The partition of India is lowered down. And where we stand today with COVID, 3 million, makes it India's worst disaster since the 1940s, whether you look at Bengal famine or whether you look at partition. It is also India's largest all India mortality shock since 1980. Right? So we are in a way living in a historic year, which means historians 100 years later will be looking at 2020-21 as a bizarre demographic year in our history. Right? And this is a bunch of estimates now placing, anywhere between 2 to 5 million. This is the actual COVID numbers. And our study, which is the Deshmukh et al. Study, is showing it as 2.7 to 3.4. All right. So the core argument of my book on pandemics, and I'll come now very specifically to migration, is two. One is that, as I said, there's this value in remembering it, and I'm going to show you specifically why or what lessons we should be remembering from the past. But because this is a department of history, I thought I should also specify this, that much of this period has been characterized by stuff like nationalism, globalization, imperialism, capitalism. In terms of historiography, these are overarching themes. It is not really seen as the age of pandemics, right? Let me put it another way. If I was teaching a course on history 100 years later, how would I characterize the years, 2020, 21, right? And for those of us who have lived through it, I think we would say that the most important thing that happened in the world in these years was COVID pandemic, right? You would probably not say it was, Trump's election, which was the most important thing that happened in 2020. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic was the most important. What's really striking to me in this whole thing is that this is a large period, millions of people died, but precisely because many of those millions were not in Europe, not in North America, which had kind of conquered some of these diseases by the middle of the 19th century, or at least kept them at bay, because the bulk of this age of pandemics happened in Asia, and within Asia and India, it has kind of lost out in global historiography. Right? It is almost like saying, writing the history of the 14th century without writing about the Black Death. You can't write the history of 14th century Europe without mentioning Black Death, because it's the most important demographic event where by some estimates, 1/3 of Europe perishes. And yet, when we look at this period, famines get a lot of attention, but not so much epidemic diseases, unless you're working in the specific field of medical history. And so that's another plea out here, that is when we talk about this period, and we talk about this period all the time because it's colonial period and so on, we need to be paying attention more to pandemics, right? Think about key events of our political history: 1857 uprising, rise of Congress, and rise of Gandhi. They can very curiously be seen on the back of an outbreak of cholera, which happened in early 1857, the outbreak of plague, along which stars like Gokhale, Tilak, Congress split can be juxtaposed against, and the rise of Gandhi in 1918-19 along the influenza pandemic. So you have three key markers of Indian political history, which also took place along the backdrop of pandemics. And by the way, there's a paper on cholera and the mutiny saying that garrison towns, which are more exposed to the cholera outbreaks, saw more mutinies. So there's a paper published on that. So there's a link also between epidemics and political activity, rioting, and so more specifically now, what do we learn from the past? So I'll start with cholera as a way to make the first very obvious point, but worth saying, that the speed of migration influences the speed of the pandemic. Right? So this is kind of the claim number one of this presentation. That is, we live in an extremely connected world, a hyper-globalized world, which means today if a disease breaks out in Wuhan, it can overwhelm the entire world within a few weeks, right? When you look at this map, and this map, by the way, is drawn by Leonard Rogers. If any of you from Calcutta, Leonard Rogers spent a lot of time in Calcutta, and his claim to fame is that he was instrumental in cutting down case fatality rates of cholera from over 50% to less than 20% using the intravenous treatment method. So fantastic, official, one of the good officials, I would say, of Indian medical history. In my book, I talk about a lot of the people who did an atrocious job. But Leonard Rogers kind of salvaged the reputation of the Indian medical service, and he was obsessed about cholera. So he wrote a lot, and this is a very interesting article he wrote, and a very nice map, because the map also shows you the dates in which the cholera outbreak was first observed. This is, of course, a very important time in Indian political history. This is the Anglo-Maratha Wars, and of course, those wars, some say, were instrumental. Many accounts of cholera was observed in the military camps. I mentioned some of that in the book. But you'll see it breaks out first in somewhere around Jessore or Calcutta, Eastern India. Cholera is endemic in that region. And you'll see 8-17 Calcutta. That's August 1817. Right? And it reaches Ceylon or Sri Lanka in January 1819. Right? So it takes about 1.5 years for it to go from Eastern India to, say, Southern India. Right? That's the kind of time. And it really reaches Europe only after a decade. And it overwhelms the whole world by about the late 1830s, early 1840s. Why there are no steamboats, there are no railways, 1817, this world we're talking about is a world, without much transport. So that's the first claim to make. That is, what we see happening across the 20th century, of course, is a tremendous, rise in transport communication. I mean, technologies, I think most people out here, know this, transport communication times was slashed across this period. And not surprisingly, these diseases became more and more prevalent or more widespread because they could go around the world much more quickly. And that response to that led to a massive quarantining system, which of course historians have talked about. Right? So that's the first thing. That is, the speed of migration influences the speed of the pandemic. Right? Now, this does not mean that globalization is, of course, necessarily a bad thing, or that if you're in a globally connected world, all it says is that yes, one of the downsides, potential downsides, there are many upsides. The potential downside is that you're more exposed to pandemic. After all, the Black Death happened in the 14th century. It was not a very well-connected world in the 14th century, and yet much of Europe was wiped out in that. So this is not a claim that globalization leads to pandemics. It's just making the obvious claim that transportation speeds, migration speeds in particular, because people are moving from one place to another, influence the trajectory of the pandemic. This is very important. Migrant flight from cities is one of the stylized facts of pandemics. You read about Black Death, you read about Decameron, you read about 14th century Italian accounts of the Black Death, you read about 17th century Italian accounts of the plague, you read about Indian accounts of the plague in Jahangir's time. It's just amazing as to how many accounts you can find in historical accounts around the world, is that when epidemic diseases just sweep through vast regions, the first common response is to leave the cities and go to the villages. Right? This is an interesting cartoon from USA, where cholera really broke out in big form in 1832, 49, 1866, where he says, you'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself. Right? And tells you two things. One is that there's an economic impact of the pandemic on urban economies, real estate sectors, and so on. Why? Because people are leaving and hence rents come down. Right? And we saw this last year. Rents were in India, the real estate market took a huge beating last year. It's reviving now, but last year was bad. And of course, what we saw last year was migrant flight. Right? And I'll come back to this migrant flight and how one can go about thinking about this in a little bit. Right? But this is to tell you that this is not just an India story. This is also a US story. And there are a lot of studies now showing that even New York last year emptied out. A lot of people left New York and went to the suburbs and outside during the pandemic. With migration comes with pandemics comes this idea of restricting mobility, and in that quarantines are very important. Right? Mark Harrison has written great stuff on quarantines and migration in the Indian context. But as Prabhu pointed out, this is also the age of mass migration, and this is the age of pandemics. It's not a coincidence, as I said, because obviously as people are moving, the chances of disease spread are also increasing. But precisely because these plantation economies around the world had to be protected, the economic imperative of that was so great, there was a natural conflict between the business lobbies, which hated quarantines, and public health officials who thought quarantines were very effective in curtailing, in a way, it is pretty much mimicking what we see today in terms of the lives versus livelihoods. And there's no doubt that, of course, a middle path had to be forged. And in this, what's really interesting to me is the difference in approach between the British Empire and the French Empire and say Germany by the late 19th century. You'll recollect that this period, the British Empire and French Empire are huge empires of the world. The French were obsessed about quarantines. The British were forced into the quarantine regime, much to their unliking, precisely because the British kind of by the late 19th century, had moved on to this laissez-faire kind of an ideology and wanted to keep trade channels. One of the arguments I make in my book is, can we blame colonial actors for pandemics and so on? In a very direct sense, no, right? But to the extent that trade channels had to be kept open, oftentimes where quarantines or some closure was required, they were not done. Business lobbies pressed hard for ports to be open, and oftentimes, obviously, you got a lot of deaths. And one of the things that you see, of course, that with deaths, you often get more misery. This lives versus livelihoods debate is slightly misleading in the sense that when a lot of lives are taken away, the livelihoods also disappear. It's kind of an underappreciated part about this lives versus livelihoods debate. That is, in influenza, there was no major lockdown in 1918, and yet 6% of the country dying means that the economy also crashes. Right? So you obviously have to pay attention on disease spread. You can't just say, let the disease rip through and we'll just keep everything open. But that seemed to be the approach by the Brits often. Complex, very complex. Some officials wanted it, some officials didn't. But the French on the whole, did not. I also point this out because there's a huge legacy of this. Today, we talk about the World Health Organization, but the World Health Organization's intellectual history, it starts in 1948. But the WHO's intellectual history starts off with a series of conferences that started off in 1851 to prevent cholera from leaving India and hitting Europe, because by then Europe had already been affected. So were quarantines effective? That's the bigger question out here. And then the 19th century literature on this is very mixed, and I give an account of this in the book. But there's no doubt that just by keeping trade channels open, that often did not work. Right? Now, whether quarantines worked or not, we don't know. But keeping everything open at all times often led to massive, massive devastation. Right? And that is why, in a way, this period is very interesting, because it kind of leads to the first efforts at global health surveillance, of which officials in India were a very key figure, because a lot of these diseases were seen to be Indian, even if though they were not necessarily breaking out from India from every time. We should know that just like many people call corona as a Chinese virus, a lot of people in the 19th century world called cholera Indian cholera. Right? And we now know that not all cholera outbreaks around the world came from India, but there was a stigma attached to it, and India was kind of seen for nearly a century as the place where epidemics break out from. This image is interesting. It's from Russia. I also show this, because you can see a bit of social distancing between the people in terms of the distances kept between them. And Russia was hugely affected by cholera to the extent, one of the most famous Russians in history, the composer Tchaikovsky, died of cholera, and so did his mother. Another way to think about migration pandemics is pilgrimages in India. That is, when you think of mobility in India, a huge class of mobility every year is through pilgrims, right? This might shock you, but even more than many other forms of migration, pilgrims constitute the biggest class. And of course, when it's the Kumbh Mela, you can be rest assured that if 75 million people are congregating one point, that's a lot of migration. Now, why I point this out is because, as you'll see again, this has huge significance about what happened earlier this year, where a lot of people were really annoyed that the Kumbh Mela was allowed to go ahead when we still had not come through the disease. Now, what do we learn from history? That in the past, we have successfully shut down pilgrimages and festivals and fairs across religious denominations, and people accepted it. Of course, there were protests. There was kind of sense that, oh, how can you do this? But there was also a sense that, after writing this book, by the way, I found a very interesting pamphlet from the Maharaja of Kolhapur, who says that this year, because of the plague outbreak, we will not be having the local pilgrimage, to this particular shrine. And in this particular chart, I wanted to show you what a researcher by the name Politzer did. He plotted cholera outbreaks in UP, United Provinces, which by the way did not see cholera too much otherwise, and kind of showed that it's precisely in the years of the Kumbh fair, Kumbh Mela years basically saw many more outbreaks of cholera than other years, right? It's a very clear thing. The other interesting lesson from this is that by the 1930s, a huge experimentation took place, whereby if you had to go for the Kumbh Mela, you had to get a cholera vaccination certificate in advance. Right. This is again harking back to many of the discussions that we have now today, where we talk about vaccine diplomacy or vaccine passports and so on. But this was actually tried out for a few years in the 1930s. Again, it was not really feasible, but this was a huge public health recommendation saying, how do we get down? In the end, cholera, remember, died out, not because of vaccination, but because of better prevention and cure. When we realized that cholera is waterborne, just basic interventions in that cut down cholera spread and incidence substantially. Okay? But this is again to remind us that in a year of a pandemic, among the class of mobility categories that you can curtail, one of them is clearly pilgrimages. And of course, there'll be a variety of decisions to make. But if you're not out of the woods yet, a good public health response typically is to shut it down. What more do we learn from the past? That, of course, there'll be discrimination, especially in a fairly unequal society like in India, along various identities. You can only expect that to happen. Two very different. One is on this slide, you'll see one quote from Ambedkar, which is actually from describing an incident in the 1940s, which is about an untouchable family set on fire, all because they thought she was the cause of cholera in the village. And on the other side, hospital staff disinfecting patients. Now you might think, okay, how is this linked to migration? And while these particular instances are not tied to migration, oftentimes migrants were seen as especially migrant workers were seen as the principal super spreaders, so to use a word that we use today, of these diseases, and often shunned against, right? And so when you think of from the perspective of a migrant, when you have to get back home, but you can't, or you're viewed negatively just for the simple act of going from point A to point B, you realize that there is something which a pandemic does. It heightens all sorts of anxieties, right? And that's a crucial characteristic of a pandemic, because in a pandemic, unlike a war, you often don't know who to blame, right? There is no external enemy. And so you're looking for someone to blame, right? And in that looking for, in that act of scapegoating, oftentimes migrant workers are, first in line of this, because when you think of disease spread, you're thinking of who is moving, and oftentimes the migrant worker is first. In my book, I also talk about other potential super spreaders who are targeted. Soldiers were considered, but they were never really targeted as super spreaders. Pilgrims, as I mentioned, traders, merchants. Interestingly, tailors during the plague was a specific occupational category, which was also. Another aspect about pandemics of the past is to understand that it takes time to understand regional variations. And I say this because today one of our, let's call it a public time pass in India is to say, why are some parts of India more affected than others? Or why are... And of course, these discussions have taken place in the past. But until you really understand the science of the disease, these are very, a lot of speculation. So last year, a lot of people in India, in a lot of conversations I had said, oh, these people in the West, again, the immunity argument, they can't handle COVID, we can. We have natural immunity against COVID. Of course, this year, those arguments seem to be very lame. This is plague. It turned out that plague disease depended tremendously on the disease ecology of the particular kind of rat and rat fleas that were required for plague transmission. And you see this, the Western Ghats region and this particular region along the Ganga where plague really hit. And much of India was actually spared the ravages of plague. Again, I say this because when you look at migration, oftentimes migrant workers got a very raw deal in India, precisely because you'll see a lot of the migrants used to come from Eastern UP, Bihar. Right? And those happen to be places where plague seemed to hit. Right? Now, this was a coincidence. You also had a lot of migrants in coastal Odisha, going to Bihar, going to Burma in the early 20th century. But it was never really mapped out as such. And it took a long time for people to figure out that it was not migration per se, but the disease ecology which is causing it. Okay, this is just to show you, different plague death rates varied substantially across provinces. You'll see Madras presidency had virtually no plague in this 40-year period. Seasonality is another aspect of epidemics which matters with migration. This is again work done on plague in India from 1902 to 1903. Plague never really came in the monsoons. There's a particular reason to it about humidity and rat fleas and so on. But I say this because one of the most effective strategies to beat plague was actually evacuation. And the British, laughed at it first. This was indigenous wisdom. This is what Indians will always, do from time immemorial. And the British kind of laughed at it at first, but then they realized that actually makes a lot of sense. And then later the science kind of proved it, that if you camp out of the villages, during the night, huge chance to reduce, plague infection. And the science later turned out to be about, how the rat flea works. The rat flea is sensitive to light and so on, doesn't quite bite during the day. And so entire villages, especially in northern India, by my estimates, we're talking about tens of millions of Indians in this period moved out. Now, this is not migration, but this is this you can almost call it short-term commutes outside the village, outside small towns, camping out in particular months where plague. And I say this because also people kind of condition themselves to the pandemic. Once you realize that a disease is seasonal, you can kind of organize your activities in a particular way. And migrants would then often do that. I say this also because migration in India is hugely according to a particular calendar. People tend to go, be in their villages from June to September during the monsoon, and then kind of leave in late August and September, and then move away to cities and so on. So this link between the seasonality of the disease and the migration is also. The quality of good camps is important. Last year, we saw many migrants returning in quarantine camps, which have atrocious quality. This is just an example, again, from a plague camp in Ahmedabad, but again, something to learn from. If you want to treat migrant workers well, if you don't want people to escape from these camps, you need to provide better facilities. The significance of anticipating reverse migration. And this is one of the key things which I continuously talk about. This again is still from Bombay. Let me now talk a little bit about this. The British, in their wisdom, they got a lot of things wrong. But what they did get right during the plague was this idea that if they shut down the Indian railways, they would lead to more havoc because people would anyway walk back home. And this is not me saying, this is the British saying it back then. And so what the British did was to organize special trains. You'll see even the image right now has a subtitle called special train. Last year we called it Shramik trains. The difference between then and now is that the trains we launched this year came 2 months late. Right? And the very specific learning we take from here is that it is very tough in India to shut down internal mobility. Right? And if you try and shut down internal mobility in the manner in which we did last year, that is just overnight shut down the Indian railways, we got an even bigger humanitarian crisis. In fact, it's not just this. We have an example from history where the trains were shut down. In China, during the plague epidemic in 1911, they actually shut down the train for migrant workers. And what do you think happened? People walked back. And basically it was January 1911, peak winter in China. And what happened eventually was a massive, massive humanitarian crisis. So we have two examples from history. One in which the trains were shut down for migrant workers, led to a humanitarian crisis, like India suffered last year. And another in which it was deliberately not done in the Indian context, allowed people to go back and then kind of resume. And in 1897, basically the same thing happened as what we saw last year. Migrants went back, half of Bombay was emptied out. And in a few months, they were back, just like what we've seen last year. Having said this, sometimes diseases can be so virulent that irrespective of whether you have the trains, whether you have buses, just some human-to-human contact can just lead the disease to go haywire. This is 1918 influenza, but this is also true of the second wave, what we call as the Delta variant, ripping through India this year. This is a very gruesome account of that, but I'll just read out some parts. The train service continued, but at all the principal stations, dead and dying people were being removed from the trains. Right? A lot of people say that we shut down the trains last year because we did not want the virus or the disease to spread to rural areas. It might have an epidemiological logic, but what we have seen in history is that even without the railways, Iran was one of the most affected countries in the 1918 influenza pandemic, by some estimates losing 10% of its population. It didn't have the railways, and it still got knocked down. Right? So shutting down the railways is not, in my view, a very appropriate strategy. In fact, what one needs to do is to have these special trains send back migrant workers and then gradually reduce mobility by different means. Okay, I'm going to skip over some slides in the interest of time. I've shown you this chart on 1918 pandemic. This is just to show you how bad it was. Influenza and masks. Come back to these points. Every pandemic requires some migration. The curtailing migration question is when, which type, and how. Right? And for that, you need to understand how migration happens in India. Various types, internal and international, and argue that's a big difference. In shutting down migration, one can easily shut down international migration. When you shut down the airspace, nobody is really going to swim back from Dubai to Bombay or swim back from London to Bombay. But when you shut down the Indian railways, people will walk back, as we saw last year, from Bangalore to Azamgarh or Delhi to Patna or Saran along India's principal migration corridor. There is a feasibility logic out here that you can shut down international migration. You have the capacity to do so, but you simply in India do not have the capacity to shut down internal mobility. Coupled with that is the fundamental fact that in India, most migration for work continues to be circular. We're saying there are about 100 million circular migrant workers, and by my estimates, about 30 million of them made their journey back last year, making it India's biggest exodus since deportation. Okay, I'm going to skip some of this about why people migrate and so on, and just move to this map. I show this map many times. This is a map using National Sample Survey 2007-8 data. It's the district level map of India. But if you're a student of history, you'll recognize the history behind this. Eastern UP districts like Azamgarh and so on have been sending out people for a really long time, right? Bihar, coastal Odisha, as I said, 100 years back, they were sending people to Burma. Today, they're sending most people to Gujarat and so on. And of course, from Gulf, from Kerala, people are going to the Gulf. From Ratnagiri, people are going to Mumbai. All the red shaded districts on this map are where the migration hotspots are. Now, this is very important for public policy because when we think of curtailing migration, we already know some of the key migration corridors of India. That should, in theory, enable better planning, which means some districts are at much higher risk of disease spread than others. Right? And that is why when we think of our quarantining policies back home, when we think of inspections at railway stations, etc., we can't allocate the same resources everywhere. You have to allocate many more resources in a district like Ganjam, where, by the way, COVID ripped through last year for a brief while, arguably because of migrants. And you need to allocate much more resources to some railway stations or some districts of India than others. Right? And so understanding India's migration corridor, this is a map of where people move from. It's a map of out migration. Right? But a lot of this migration goes to India's principal cities, which is the key cities, especially cities like Delhi, Surat, Mumbai, and so on. In my first book, India Moving, I have a whole chapter on this map and the history behind these migrations, whether it is the history of Udupi migration or Saran district or Ratnagiri, Ganjam. So coming back to this picture, why did so many people go back last year? History tells us that people will go back for two simple reasons. One, if you don't have a job, you will not have an income. And without an income, you cannot survive in an Indian city. The holding power of migrant workers, especially in the informal sector, is very low. What labor historians will call as precarious labor. But I would argue there's an even bigger reason, which is psychology. That is, even if hypothetically we gave a lot of social security, a lot of economic security to migrant workers and say, please stay here, don't go back, they will still want to go back. And that has a very deeper, psychological response. And I'll summarize this by a particular sentence which was heard back in the day during the plague as well as last year. And it kind of goes something like, agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. That is, if you have to die, we'd rather die back in the village. There's a particular attachment to the native land that is, and because we're talking mostly of male migrant workers in much of these, many of these clusters, the attachment to die in the place where you're born is so strong in India that is, even with the best intentions, like last year, the Kerala government, relatively speaking, did a great job for migrant workers, yet most of them left Kerala and went back, right? So you have to assume that people will go back, because a lot of people in middle class India last year said, oh, why are these people going back? The government said, don't move, just stay where you are. But it doesn't work that way. The economic and cultural, or let's call it psychological response is far, far too deep. So that's why, when you curtail migration, you can do it for international migration, but you can't do it for internal migration. I make a distinction there. And when we say how It means focusing on the migrant corridors, arranging special trains at the onset of a pandemic. Obviously, we need stuff like portable social security, better rental housing, contractor accountability. These are stuff which we've been saying for a long time. Some steps in the right direction, like we have the One Nation, One Ration card scheme now, though it is still not fully operational, but that's a step in the right direction. But we still need to understand our migrant labor much better. And this pandemic, I think many of the mistakes could have easily been avoided if some history was known. And I'll end here with that, kind of point that because I happen to be on this Lancet committee on COVID-19, at least, one person from the government task force has kind of messaged me saying, if only we had known this. And that is the kind of strongest, message I think history gives. That is, if only some of this stuff was known, maybe some of the policy choices could have been very different from last year. Maybe arguably we would have seen less impact on livelihoods and lives than what we saw this year. I'll end here by just saying that, there seem to be these 4 stages of a pandemic: denial, confusion, acceptance, and erasure. In March 2020, when I started to write this book, there seemed to be a lot of denial mode that nothing can happen to Indians, then a lot of confusion, the migration crisis, then an acceptance that we're here. There's a strange sense of erasure, forget 100-year erasure, just a few month erasure between, say September 2020 and February 2020. And maybe even now, as the second wave has kind of peaked out, many people seem to be, in this mode that the pandemic is over. It is true that the exposure to the virus is so immense now that the chances of a third wave imminent in the next 1 or 2 months is very, very low, as epidemiologists would say. But pandemics, as the cholera has shown, took a century. Plague was 2 decades in India. And influenza, which is closest, a few years at least. One has to be prepared. And in this, migrant workers have to be in your first line of communication. I think one of the big flaws in the strategy last year was also that even when we had the lockdown, we reached out to migrant workers very late in the day. It should have really been communicated during the lockdown itself. So with that, I'll end. I run a social media handle on Twitter and Instagram on business and economic history. If you're on Twitter and Instagram, you can see this. We also run a history internship. And if you're an enrolled student, feel free to apply to this. All the details on this are online. So with that, I'll stop and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Wonderful, concise, and brilliantly structured talk. Chinmay, I would like to open the floor to discussion or to points, comments, but remember that we have about half an hour's time, and so we should leave Chinmay some 10 minutes. Chinmay, it's best that perhaps we should collect some questions.
Sure.
So I'll wait for a few minutes or 2-3 minutes to I don't know what is the you raise your hands here, Abhijit.
Yeah, so anyone who wants to ask the question can raise their hands, and then they can be called out and they can ask their questions themselves.
Yeah, I sometimes cannot see all the hands. I can only see.
Yeah, I'll do that, sir.
Abhijit, you will, huh? Okay.
Yes.
And please convey who are the people. So as you're thinking and asking, may I just open the I'll just take in just that, I can't see any hands right now. Immediately, I'm sure you are all fully convinced by Chinmay's argument. So it'll take some time to open up the pores of your curiosity. So you can ask factual questions or also the theoretical basis for it. So some of it I take out from his last, it was about, say, what is policy options. So here's the causation of migration and pandemic relation, why people go back home during pandemic. He set it out as economic and psychological. And I think they're both very, very right in many ways. But what I find also something, Chinmay, I would like an answer. I think it's very difficult to immediately answer because you answered some of it. That pandemic is a political phenomenon. Well, there's nothing that is not political. It is constructed by structure of governance, of power, and politics in a purely that sense. The power, like in your book also several times, the epidemiology, what is it called? Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, our own acts, Disaster Management Act of 2006, how they, and a whole lot of political combination, including scapegoating of particular kinds. All these are forms not just of shaping the pandemic, constructing the pandemic as a social phenomenon, as a social event, as someone mentioned it, but also how the challenges are taken. Of course, there are economic aspects which are underlying it. So I wanted you to, even though you posed the question and said, well, colonial state, if it is not, we can not only directly say that they created the pandemic, but we can indirectly say that by for instance, not doing enough for infrastructure, not doing enough for public health, perhaps they shaped it. Okay. So at least some way in which you have already pointed out. I would like a direct understanding that all these are, or how do you respond to this question that pandemic, like migrations, are at heart political phenomena. Now, what is considered a migrant? Who is a migrant itself is a political act, defined through law, defined by state action, defined through the borders which constitute your definition as migrant. And those are political phenomena. So I just said both of these. Chinmay, this is a very, I think you are very, very careful and precise historian and meticulous about it. I don't expect that. But please, how would you respond to my way of this? Sorry.
I think what we've seen in the current pandemic is, of course, there's no doubt, what you're saying is that who is a migrant is often seen very differently. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. The international migrant is seen much more positively than internal migrant. And the proof of that in our public policy response is that it took 1 week to wind down our airspace and 4 hours to wind down the rail space. That 1 week of winding down airspace was very important. People knew that the airspace was good. I mean, people were expecting it between 17th March and 24th March last year. International migrants, had that thing. We also sent out planes to get our people back in some places. And some of that started before the Shramik trains had started. So that was one separation. That is, we seem to be favoring these international migrants much more than internal migrants. That's what seems to play out. Within India, I think there's also this big difference between interstate migrants and intrastate migrants. Most people who went back most migrants, workers for India, migrate within the state borders. And last year's the restrictions did not really hurt them that much as the interstate migrant workers because state borders were sealed. And in my view, that's just not pragmatic. In India, what we saw last year was literally hundreds of thousands of people walking to the state border. The state border was sealed. They would walk down a few kilometers, cross it, and continue. So we don't have we don't have the capacity to deal with stopping internal mobility, even if it is well-intentioned and so on. So there is difference between the intrastate and the interstate migrant worker. That runs into a lot of political issues. And I think that was a huge issue last year, because I remember, in Gujarat, migrant workers wanted to go back to Bihar. And the Bihar government said, hang on, you stay on there. So the migrant worker then, one is the Indian government announced this national lockdown 4-hour notice period. But then the migrant worker also had to negotiate the state government whims and fancies about first Gujarat government saying, we can't let you go out because that's the rule. And then once they were willing to let these guys go back, the Bihar government said, oh, but we don't want to take them back. So in a way, the migrant worker, got trapped under many, many layers of government. When they went back, by the way, the village council sometimes said, we won't allow you in the village. So across, multiple kind of layers of governance, they were trapped. And this is not true of course, well-off migrant workers, for example, like me, who have not seen my parents for many, for a long time, but the holding capacity for me is much more. I don't need to go back in that sense. But for millions of people, the need to go back was huge. So there's no doubt that the migrant worker last year in particular got trapped in multiple levels. And in that sense, the interstate migrant worker in India, I think, continues to be a very vulnerable person. In fact, more vulnerable, I would say, than even during British times. And in British times, interprovincial migration, there was never really any bar on interprovincial migration, barring maybe the Mulki rules in Nizam, Hyderabad. But apart from that, not much. And add on to that, after all of this, Haryana passed a domicile law saying, migrant work, job quota for locals and so on, which is, in my view, blatantly anti-constitutional. So, clearly a lot of stuff is going on now in India across the political, and I would say it's all political parties are seeking for, jobs for the locals, right? And in that process, again, pitting the local vis-a-vis the migrant worker. So it's unfortunate, but I think the migrant worker in India has been trapped at multiple levels. Having said that, in a very twisted way, just like, like the influenza pandemic of 1918, wiped out 6% of the population, but at the same time, the survivors got a better deal in the sense bargaining power went up and so on. I mean, that's one. Or the Black Death of 14th century shifted capital labor relations, and that's the kind of argument. In a very twisted way, precisely because of this massive migration crisis, for the first time, migrant workers are there very visibly, for many people who have never even thought about migration. And so migration as a subject today is a really hot topic for research, for public policy, for variety of things. And that is why a lot of policy attention is on migrant workers. So that is the only unintended consequence of this whole thing, is that I think hopefully going forward, people will not shut down the railways in 4-hour notice. I think that's simply not on as a public policy measure. So I don't think I've answered your kind of question, but I think broadly put, the migrant worker in India tends to get trapped in many layers of governments and of course bureaucracy. But bureaucracy, all of us get trapped at some point or the other. But the migrant worker in particular, because of so many different jurisdictions, gets trapped. And one way, of course, is to have voting power in the destination regions. So that's potentially one way.
Okay, I see Deepak has asked a question in the comment section. Deepak, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Oh, so hi sir, thank you for this talk. Basically, I want to understand the historicity of the psychology you talked about. The way there was this urge to go back home among the people. So I just want to understand how these kind of psychology among the masses, particularly migrant workers, developed over time periods, and what are the factors? Can we separate it from the political economy of the time period, which is there at that time or in the contemporary time?
I think it's a larger question on why is migration so circular in India. That's irrespective of pandemics, people want to go back. You'll be surprised to know that most people who moved to Bombay never stayed in Bombay. The numbers are very clear. Most people who go to Bombay actually eventually leave Bombay and go back. Of course, a lot of people settle down, and that's how the city becomes big. But in terms of just the sheer, in crude terms, gross flows are much larger than net flows. People are coming into a city, but people also leave. So this is a question really about, I think a pandemic really heightens this concern of or need to go back. So to flip your question, why do migrant workers in India continue today to go back, right? And that is a huge historiography in labor history and so on. There are two ways to pitch this. One is source region factors, and the other is destination region factors. Much of the literature, I think, has focused on the destination region factors. For example, an unwelcome labor market or an unwelcome real estate sector where you can never afford a house in Bombay. So you can never really put your feet down in Bombay because it's just you're priced out of most markets. Right? So that is a destination region factor. They're saying a destination region is hostile, and hence this constant need to have another base somewhere. Right? Think of the Kerala migrant worker in the Gulf. So many Keralites go to the Gulf, but by law you can't get citizenship there. So that's also a destination region factor. Right? The Keralites going to US are settling down, many of them. right? But the Keralites who are going to the Gulf can't settle down. So that's a clear destination region. But I would argue that they are also very close, very important source region factors. Part of this is about gender. It's about why, when you say the circularity, often it's because the male is outside and the woman is back home. The prototype, Eastern India kind of migration. And that's often because women, the mobility norms on women are very different from that of men. Certain expectation on what women are supposed to do back home. There's an expectation that women will look after land, will look after the larger family in the absence of the main figure. Right? So in my PhD thesis, by the way, I looked at this. I was working in Surat on these factories on my research, and there was this family from Khandesh, tribal family from Khandesh, where both the man and the woman were on the shop floor. And the Biharis were these single male migrant workers. And so it's a classic kind of comparison of the family migration versus the single male migration. And part of it, you realize is cultural in the sense it's about the norms and mobility. The Khandesh guy can't think of not moving with his wife. And similarly, and vice versa, the wife can't think of his husband going without her. Whereas it is the norm in Bihar and Eastern UP that the man goes and so then, of course, you have a larger story as to what explains gender norms and so on. So you keep going on a iteration with that. So your question about can be separated from the political economy of the period, I think it's a larger question. It's also, of course, the mass migration really started in the late 19th century. But some of these districts, the migrations have been going on for even longer. First in military labor markets and so on of the past. So this is the question of why is migration in India so circular in general terms? And I would say it's a combination of two. There's no doubt that cities in India can be quite hostile and so on, and it takes a lot to kind of settle down in a city. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of this is also source region, and that is why people. So in what a pandemic does is obviously your job goes out, and then, as I said, the psychological response of trying to die where you were born. I mean, it's this very, very strong attachment coming. Now, if your question is, where does this attachment come from? Tough to say. I really don't know. That's a good historiography to kind of develop as to attachment to native land and how does this vary across India? How does this vary across the world? What is it about land in particular that makes it such an important thing? Because and this is where you'll have to get into caste and so on, because we know from the literature on migration that Brahmins have been the first to leave in most villages. They've been the first to permanently leave many villages and move to the city. Whereas as you go along the middling caste and so on, if you look at the data, NSS data, it's the middle castes who actually do who own some land, but are kind of the most circular in terms of these things. So you can situate it at many levels, I think, but I think gender, caste, and so on are important factors in this story as well. Maybe not just a pure political economy of that period.
Professor Bava has also asked a question in the chat box. Ma'am, should I read it out or would you be asking?
Okay, I'll just ask the question. I'm really happy that you use so many visuals. As an art historian, that's what interested me. Of course, the rest of the talk was interesting also, and how you related to the responses that were all kinds of responses, official, unofficial, reportage, etc., that were there. Now, what interests me, and I don't know if you've actually looked at this at all, is whether photographs and etchings treat these narratives in different ways, because the artist intervenes in far more ways in etchings than he or she does in photographs, and how this would then, inform any responses in the larger public to the pandemic and to migrations, both?
Yeah, it's a very good question. My sense is, of course, a lot of these visuals are very morbid images, right? And as compared to general, the use of pictures in general history and so on, this is very specific. It's typically showing devastation, grief. In that sense, there's some literature on famines and representation of, say, 1876 and so on. When we talk about this particular period and disease, there's not that much visual imagery of cholera. It's pretty much on plague. And there's no doubt that plague has historically evoked a much larger visual kind of response. My sense is, and so to give a sense, I'm kind of using a question to say, why is it that plague was visually much more represented than cholera or influenza, or for that matter, many of these other diseases? And I do think that it's because most of these images are coming from the British in this time period. It's because the British themselves had a crazy idea of plague, in the sense that Europe had the Black Death of 14th century, but you'd be amazed how many times when you're looking at these reports, London was devastated by plague in the 1660s. I mean, it was burned down once by fire, and there's also the plague. So there was a very strong historical consciousness among the ruling class in India, the British, about plague as a disease. And that's why, they just went nuts, literally, so to speak, about plague. They captured every element of it possible. They had plague photo albums. By the way, for many of you, there's a lovely digital archive called the Visual Plague Project. And it's collected literally thousands of photographs of this particular plague episode, India, China, many countries, from roughly 1890s to 1920. It's a wonderful, it's a project housed at Cambridge. It's called the Visual Plague Project. So that's one part, of your question. That is, firstly, between the different diseases, one disease stood out. And that was a disease which was very rooted in the historical consciousness of Europe, and especially this thing. Secondly, plague as a disease also stood out. You could see those boils and so on people. It was a very visual disease, so to speak. Unlike, say, malaria, which you got a fever and died. It was a very different visual. It evoked a very different. That's why we have very little visual representation of many of these. So one is also about the disease itself. That the more visual the disease, you could see that a person had plague or leprosy and so on. You could not see if a person had, a malaria or influenza and so on. About the people who captured these images, I tried to, learn a fair amount on that. A lot of these were specialists, so they had come. So that is why I'm saying, it was a project to also capture these images, right? And so Illustrated London News, had a huge series on many of these things. As I said, the plague commissioned an album of photographs of all the activities that they were doing. I think it's because the British were trying to show that they were doing all these things in order to prevent plague from reaching British shores. The reason they went all out in curtailing plague as compared to the diseases, as I said, they did not want a repeat of what happened in London in the 1660s. It was very strong in the memory. So I hope that's answered some of the question, but because you mentioned about visual imagery, and because there are many students here, this is something I like to tell students of history. If you send me any photograph of the 1918 influenza flu in India, I would be very, very happy. And if you did your dissertation on this, I'll tell your professors to give you an A. Imagine 20 million Indians wiped out, complete havoc for a few months, and I have not been able to find a single, I'm not able to find a single image of the 1918 influenza pandemic. My last visit to NMML in Delhi, I went through, I don't know how many newspapers, Searchlight, Patna, Tribune, virtually every newspaper I've still not gone through the entire list. So some of you, if you're in Delhi, please go and check this out. I thought newspapers will have photographs. Turns out they don't. And the reason, I think, is one, the photographers were maybe dead because so many people died, or they were too sick to go out and work. But two, there was so much of scarcity in that particular year. There was a drought, inflation at 30%, raw material supplies were low. Newspapers were very thin in general. I write in my book, Goa newspaper cut down its production to one page, just the cover page. They had some text and that's it. So there was a general cutback in news production. But the newspapers I've gone through have no image. I came across one image of a person who died, and I was hoping he died of influenza, so I could say, this is a person who died of influenza. Turned out, it was a normal death, so to speak. And this was in Searchlight. So this is a great project for any person, especially working on visual representation. And that, I think that's also on addressing this question. Why is it that we have no visual representation? Why do we have so much of it on the plague and zero evidence of influenza? In fact, somebody will say, oh, this thing never happened because you can't show me a single photograph of it. How can you say that 20 million Indians died when we don't have a single photograph?
Chinmay, would a painting do? Because I know paintings made of the plague, just as of the famine, where you have an entire documentation program by artists. So
I'm still looking for a photograph, but if if you paint on 1918 influenza in particular,
Okay.
I would still be interested. I have cartoons, I have, some other stuff.
All
But
right.
this is a time of photography. I mean, by 1918, photographs were, because
Yeah,
play
absolutely.
1890s were also well captured. So
Chinmay,
sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Chinmay, the famous, Santosh has raised it, but this is just relevant to this. That famous photograph of Gandhi in 1918, lying down and treating himself with whatever natural therapy. There is a photograph of Gandhi I think it's Ahmedabad. It's in Ahmedabad, or he's sitting in Ahmedabad, or maybe in the ashram somewhere. Yeah. So So is that photograph about? People said, no, this is not about flu, not the influenza. It was some other fever he had.
Yeah.
But
So
do you remember that photo? You must have seen that photograph.
I've not seen the photograph, but I'm going with Ram Guha's interpretation, because I did look, because it's widely come across in Indian articles that Gandhi contracted the flu in 1918. But Ram Guha's book, I looked at it very carefully, and Ram Guha is very confident that it was a dysentery. So, so I didn't push further along that line. But it is true that Tagore lost family members, so that's one line of inquiry. If somebody wants to go, to see the person in Tagore's family who died, the person in Gandhi's family also lost a member. Maybe there are some photographs. Again, I'm not saying that no photographs exist. I'm sure they exist. And you can say it's my lifetime project to get these photographs into a nice exhibit and stuff like that. So if you ever come across any photograph anywhere we're looking for basically September, October, November 1918. These are the months in which it really happened. I'll be very happy to find out. But I think the significance, of course, of not having visual representation is that also we've completely forgotten it. Influenza is kind of wiped clean of our collective consciousness, and that killed 20 million Indians. Just a few months after that, we had the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, which killed a few hundred people. We have a memorial, we have a lot of things, you can see the difference, 20 million Indians, few hundred people. The difference being the pandemic, there's no clear enemy. With the Cholera tragedy, that the British, there's a very different response to these things. But just think about the numbers, 20 million versus, few hundred. But, we know much more in some ways about the Cholera tragedy than the influenza. Yeah.
Santosh,
thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. In fact, Chinmay, thank you for this such an excellent talk. And Prabhu is also here. Chinmay, Prabhu was my supervisor, PhD research supervisor.
Hey.
For the book I have just written. And Chinmay, the question is, don't you think the epicenters of migration in last 1 century are just increasing in India? Of late, in last 2-3 decades, I have discovered in my ongoing project that Bundelkhand is the new epicenter of migration. And from Rajasthan, we can add more districts. And again, your theory becomes quite useful that returning, the circulating workers took pandemic along with them to their back home. Because Bundelkhand, again, a high number of deaths due to pandemic. And same thing happened in certain specific migrant areas of Rajasthan. So does it reflects upon underdevelopment, that more and more centers are becoming more and more towns and rural areas are becoming scarce in terms of employment opportunities? Number one. Number two, this is related, but a very important factor was female domestic workers. They have been totally ignored, except some newspaper reports and some of the publications, largely in policy making. Female laborers, at least I know female spinners in living areas of Azamgarh, suffered more because migrant males stopped sending money orders or money transfers. And who was going to purchase clothes when people were dying out? So what is your response regarding these two issues? These are merely observations.
Yeah, I think the first one, changing migration patterns. Firstly, I would love to read anything on Bundelkhand migration. I think it's one of the least researched aspects in India. See, I have a chapter in my book called Migration and Development. It's very complex. The links between migration and development, especially in India, have confounded theorists for a long time. As I like to, start my migration talks with, the poorest part of India in economic terms, Bihar, and the richest part on many dimensions in Kerala, they have the same rates of outmigration. Right? I mean, the poorest part of India and the richest part of India. Of course, from Kerala, most people go to the Gulf, and from Bihar, people also go to the Gulf, but they go to many other places. So in India, if you have a hypothesis that some places are being impoverished, and that's why the pressure to move out there's no doubt that that's happening in some parts. But in a lot of places, they're also moving out because of prosperity. I think of coastal Andhra, fantastic agricultural scene. They first moved to Guntur and now, USA. That's been the kind of migration trajectory of coastal Andhra. So there is migration out of poverty and destitution, and there's migration because of prosperity, because the younger generation does not want to do farming, wants to aspires very different careers, and the classic more permanent rural to urban migration takes place. I think to reframe your thing, you need to look at the duration of migration. The worst kind of migration in India happened for very few months. And the more kind of enriching migrations typically are for many, many years, where you're invested in the city for that much more time. And that's how I look at it. And the semi-permanent are the ones, So short-term seasonal migration in India are often the most vulnerable, just tremendous exploitation which happened. Very little upward mobility has been documented in those streams. Of course, even research out there suggests that migration was better than no migration. Because the starting point, of course, in Indian agriculture is quite bleak, often at the mercies of rainfall and stuff like that. Migration also requires networks. Once those networks kick in, often you get a chain effect. And that is why the map I showed you, it's not a coincidence that this persistence exists between late 19th century and today migration, because those networks, as you know, Azamgarh network is huge. You need to know people in different places in order to go. So from Bundelkhand, historically, that connection has been less. Either the British did not recruit from there early on, those linkages did not start up, right? As compared to, say, Chota Nagpur, as compared to Eastern UP, Bihar, and so on. So Bundelkhand is actually an interesting region overall. And I'll be really curious, because at least the NSS data of 2007-8 did not really show the numbers. If you are interested in the one place of India where outmigration has really increased tremendously in the last 2 decades, it's West Bengal. West Bengal, huge outmigration. So that's the one we are documenting very well. Anthropologists are talking about it, economists are documenting it, and so on. So complex reasons. The second part about women, I think the labor studies, of course, now the good studies on women domestic workers and so on. But you're right that in general the research has focused mostly on male migrant workers. Much of my research is also focused on that, and we need to know much more about women domestic workers. I just say that we tend to think of all women domestic workers as migrant, but we have to also understand that a lot of people who work in cities were born in the cities. And that is why female domestic work is not necessarily congruent with migration. There is a lot of people who especially work in people's homes in cities were born in the cities, right? And so that is just one conceptual thread. And with that, I'm just going to answer what Mrityunjay has pointed out. What is the actual definition of migration? We use, classically survey-based kind of definitions, national sample survey or the census. You have two ways to define migration: birth-based or place of last residence. So birthplace means if you are born in Calcutta and if you move to Delhi and you're enumerated in Delhi, you're a migrant. Right now, whether you migrated for work, for marriage, it doesn't matter. You're a migrant. The problem with this definition is, what if you go back to Calcutta? What if you move from Calcutta, move to Delhi, spend 10 years in Delhi, and then go back to Calcutta? On the basis of birth, you're no longer a migrant in Calcutta. And that is why the census office also asks you a question on place of last residence. So typically that residence basis, are you staying in your current place for at least 6 months? If not, then where earlier, and then you're classified as a migrant. So for example, this person who's gone back to Calcutta from Delhi would be captured as a return migrant by the basis of place of last residence. So place of last residence helps us capture migration from multiple moves, which is very important in India, because I'll tell you what happens. If you go to Kerala, the census records very few people in Kerala as migrants, right? But we know that a huge part of Kerala population has gone to the Gulf and come back, right? Why? Because when you ask a question also, often people say that, we are from here. People don't typically say, oh, we went there, worked for 10 years and came back. That's why you be very specific in your questions about migration. So that's the definition of migration. Typically 6-month window as usual place of residence or place of birth. Now, some of the things I mentioned here, like evacuation, commuting, that's very short term, right? So if you're going from Thane to South Mumbai, that's called commuting. If you can do it in a day, it's movement, but it's not really migration in the classical sense. So we're typically looking for at least more than a day. And then, of course, you get into a lot of conceptual problems. A lot of women report migration for marriage, when in reality, a lot of it is also for work. So those are the kind of additional conceptual issues on migration. But I should tell you that the census has been recording migration from pretty much late 19th century, but that was always on the basis of birth. And as I argued, and labor historians know very well, a lot of that migration statistics, it was useful to understand migrations in Assam, which is a destination region, but it never really captured out-migration from a region. In India, to the extent that that out-migration is male-dominated, it often altered sex ratio. And that's why in my research, I used a lot of sex ratios to understand out-migration, because it alters the balance of women and men in particular age groups. So you look at sex ratio charts of 1901 in India, you can clearly see where people are moving from, rather than the actual migration statistics.
Okay. You have also Saurabh and Nagvan, but Saurabh first. Quickly, Saurabh, if you want to ask, or should we? Can you see his? He's asking stigmatization.
So these questions I think are from Facebook. So I have posted them in the comment section. So I guess we'll have to read them out.
Okay. Chinmay, the question is basically about stigmatization of migrant labor of particular regions or particular religion or group, community. So it is not, it's a selective, so basically, let's say racialization or racial stigmatization.
To be very blunt, these attitudes, these superiority attitudes against specific migrant workers have changed in different parts of India over time, right? So I come from a city called Mumbai. As a side note, we changed our surname in response to the anti-South Indian, movement. Initially, the people were anti-South Indians. Then there was this period of anti-Gujaratis, and of course now in the last 20 years, most people, a lot of people in Mumbai are upset about the Biharis and UP. So you'll see one city. First, the South Indians were seen to be as the evil people, then the Gujaratis, and then the Biharis and UP. So it's all about, at that point of time, who are you kind of seeing as it's basically political rhetoric, where political rhetoric has been heightened against migrants. That's where the general population also does the stigmatization. So it's not surprising that in Assam, in Mumbai, this has been quite heightened, right? Historically speaking. In my work in Surat, it was interesting to see perceptions. So to answer this question, in the diamond industry. So diamond industry is completely trust-based, right? Because they're high-value stuff which is moving across hands, and they employ mostly Gujaratis. So Gujarati owners mostly employing Gujaratis, though different castes. And when we ask them questions about who will you not employ, right? That's kind of what reveals then these preferences. And it's interesting because Surat gets people from all across India because they also have a textile industry. But in those responses, they did have a sense that, okay, Gujaratis are okay. Next in preference, maybe Rajasthanis, then Madhya Pradesh, UP, but the last in order is Bihar, right? And so at least in my research, I have come across these kind of preferences. Now, why? It's tough to say. As I said, it changes from time to time. Sometimes South Indians are blamed, sometimes North Indians are blamed. Depends where you are in India and what is the political rhetoric at that time. But I don't think it's completely fixed. I don't think the Biharis are blamed everywhere at all points of time and so on. But there's no doubt that as the region which sends out a lot of migrants, they tend to get flack. And often, many times, migrants are blamed for everything in the city. Rapes go up, migrants are blamed. Crimes go up, migrants are blamed. Whether the migrants are doing it or not, irrespective. Right? So in a way, easy scapegoating. So that's an unfortunate reality in internal migration.
There's one by Minu Kanodia, which says, did the British governance contribute to pandemic in some ways? Patterns of or did it help, so it's a comparison of policy measures. So just to add to this question, just a little bit, the 1918 epidemic had this. There is I think a clear. I don't know whether it's been published. The movement of the pandemic along the railway movement, isn't that been studied? In some ways, the pandemic comes from Bombay. It begins from Bombay and then it moves to several other places through the railways. There's some tracking of railways down to even Punjab. Many soldiers, returned soldiers through that. Is that established in some ways? And the particular type of, is that established?
I'll answer your thing and then Nina's point. As I said, in 1918, it didn't really matter whether, as I said, Iran lost 10% of its population without the railways. It reached remote Alaska where there was, virtually no. It was just unusually violent, that particular fight. So it didn't really matter. Now, it doesn't, of course, deny the fact that the railways contributed to the spread. But what I'm trying to point out is that, it could have been anything, any transport mechanism, because it was just unusually violent. There is a paper by Siddharth Chandra et al. It's an epidemiology journal, and they look at railways. They do find the railways matter, but if you look carefully, they find that even road transport matters. Basically, any human-to-human connection. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And one of the reasons, by the way, the railways were shut down last year is the drawing of lesson from that. I mean, arguably, that is, look, if you shut down transport system completely, you contain it completely, then this will not spread. I have two responses to that. One is, at the time we locked down last year, the disease had not yet really reached India. There was still time to let our migrant workers go back and then have, much more localized restrictions. And if you want a national lockdown, also that. But the problem last year was, in a way, it was completely self-defeating because we opened up the trains. We had the special trains in the month of May at a time when the infection rates were high. So in a sense, it kind of defeated the original purpose completely. So we should have, allowed these migrant workers to go back first and then toy with this idea of shutting down a transport system. These are tough policy choices. I mean, there's no doubt that in pandemic management, and I'm coming to Meenu's question now, you whatever you do, you're damned. You shut down the railways, people have a problem. You don't shut down the railways, you say, oh, you let the virus spread everywhere. So these are very, very hard policy. But what you need is clear communication. I think where we kind of I think a key mistake last year was poor communication with migrant workers in particular. And we're talking of tens of millions of people last year. So this thing about governance and so on, two ways to look at it. And there's a nice framework of, lives, livelihood, and so on. How much of pandemic management is good luck and, luck versus policy, right? In the sense that even if you do everything by the playbook of pandemic management, you can, get routed by a pandemic, right? I think one has to, when one starts judging countries or state governments of India, one has to be very careful in mind about what are you judging people on, right? I think you should judge governments on transparency. Transparency about the numbers. If they're fudging, death numbers, if they're fudging case numbers. I'm not judging states if they have a large number of deaths or cases. But if you're going to hide those numbers, then there is a problem, right? So that is the way, I would look at governance or judging kind of governance. So the British, I mean, it works all ways. There's no doubt the British also contributed in terms of scientific development. They obviously, did not want, they were not trying to create those pandemics. They were as obsessed about curtailing it. But as I mentioned in my book, many times they got it wrong. There's a paper now published in a top economics journal called the Review of Economics and Statistics on the 1918 flu, which said that districts where the civil service officer was British had more deaths than districts in which the civil service officer was Indian.
Really?
So just, the identity of the bureaucrat mattered. Now, I have some problems with this overall argument because what I pointed out in my work is that the princely states were actually some of the most affected parts. Rajasthan, Hyderabad were completely knocked out in the 1980s. Right? So then in the hierarchy, Indian bureaucrat in British rule district is greater than, British bureaucrat in British rule district is greater than any bureaucrat in the princely state. So that is another way of looking at this. But these are interesting kind of notions about, what mattered in the past. the way I've looked at it is look at good practices. For example, the BMC this time, Bombay Municipal Corporation, Mumbai Municipal Corporation, they had this policy of chase the patient policy. It's a fantastic idea. In a pandemic, you don't let patients come to hospitals. You go to patients, because we know that hospital system gets overwhelmed. Right? It's I would say the first order principle of hospital management or pandemic management. Now, this was done by Viswesvarayya's team in Mysore, princely state of Mysore, in 1918, where they said, let's go to the houses, check their temperatures, give them basic nutrition, because they realized with some nutrition you could tide over influenza. Right? And so there are some interesting public policy practices of those times, some by the British, some by princely states, and so on. There is no doubt the overall numbers look very bad. India was badly hit by influenza. I argued that also the drought of 1918 matters to some extent. Plague was also a matter of hubris. When I showed you that chart, the first few years, they thought they were doing a good job, but you don't know if you're doing a good job until you understood the disease. That's the reality of the pandemic. Only once you understood how the disease transmits itself, do you really understand whether you're doing a good job or not? Because you can get lucky, as simple as that. Eastern India and Southern India just got lucky during the plague, as I showed you that map. It was not because they were doing a better job at plague management. It's just that they didn't get the particular kind of rats and rat fleas involved. So judging governance is very tricky in pandemic management. But yes, compared with 0 deaths and millions of deaths, you can clearly make some judgment. And there's no doubt that I think India could have done much better in pandemic management overall. And I say this not with hindsight, but with, I've been writing about this on the migration issue, on the death numbers and so on. And there's still so much we can do. We've done a lot on vaccination in the last few months, but we need to be doing a much better job on our numbers, on the death numbers. As I said, the 3 million is what we think is the actual number, closer to the truth than the 400,000. So, your last part, help the migrants. In a pandemic, we should not be, scapegoating migrants, as simple as that.
Yeah. Just a thing, Chinmay, can you answer this quickly? Do we have data about, are there more case fatality amongst migrants compared to non-migrants? Is there any way you can say that more migrants died or more migrants were afflicted? Or afflicted is now it's a very difficult thing, seropositivity ratio. But I'm saying
in the current pandemic.
Yes.
I'm just going to take a 10-second break.
Yes.
Professor Serge, I just wanted to say that we're short on time, so perhaps we can take 2 last questions and then wind up.
Yeah.
There's right. One in the comment section and
Nandita.
Yeah.
Nandita and Nagwant, we can, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so this quickly, if you answer, but if you have this thing, if you don't have, that's fine. But there are 2 questions where I'll ask Mr. Nagwant Singh, he's raised his hand quickly, and Nandita Goswami, who asks about deaths not caused by cholera, plague, or influenza during the period under discussion. That is like some malaria or whatever, normal fever death. What do these deaths tell us about pandemic system? That's an interesting question. Non-pandemic deaths tell us about pandemic. What way?
Yeah, so I'll talk about that particular period. This is a period of exceptionally high death rates, period. Pandemic or no pandemic, right? So we're talking of a world. This is one thing which I think many people who don't have exposure to demography don't really appreciate. The life expectancy of human beings pretty much around the world before 1850 was in the 20s, which means at birth, you could expect to live only about 25 years. So you're talking about death rates in the range of 30 or 40 per thousand. Today, India's death rate is about 7 per thousand. We're saying about 5 times higher death rate in general in history until the 1850s. The first countries which broke this barrier were, in Western Europe, then US and so on. And India started breaking this only after 1920. So the other thing is between 1870 and 1920, India's death rate actually increased.
Yes.
Right. So that is also an important point. Now, what caused these deaths? And I pointed out in my book that pandemic deaths, despite that massive number, is only about 5% of all deaths. Right. So first is historically, the key thing about deaths was infant mortality. Life expectancy at birth was very low because most infants died. And that the number one cause for that was malaria. Various diseases, but as I say, malaria was like the number one killer of that thing. So death rates overall start to fall in any society, typically when infant mortality rates start to fall. So you have malaria, Tuberculosis is less understood, but we know that today, tuberculosis is the most important communicable disease which causes deaths in India. What happens is, in any society, communicable diseases proportion of total deaths is typically about 90% initially. And then it falls, like in the US, it's under 10%. In India today, that number is 30%. Okay, so 30% of Indians still succumb to diseases rather than stuff like a heart attack or something. About, what do these deaths tell us about pandemics historically? One of the things which I would like to argue is that this particular period, 19th century, and especially late 19th and early 20th century, India also unfortunately got 3 massive rainfall shocks. And you might think, oh, droughts happen all through Indian history. No. From the time we've collected rainfall data from the middle of the 19th century till today, we have not had the intensity of those 3 droughts. These are India's 3 worst droughts in recorded history. They happened in 1877, we got the Great Famine. We got 1899, another huge famine, and 1918, which interacted with influenza. Now, these, you might ask, what is the significance? These droughts were so severe that water level, they really were depleted across the Indian subcontinent, which means overall crop production, overall nutrition levels were, took a real beating. So you can argue that, the British made it worse and so on, but there's no doubt that the exogenous shock was, really bad rainfall. So this is a period where death rates in India were genuinely very high in general. They were increasing, and on top of that, you got the pandemics. And I think this is important to kind of teach, when we talk about general history about these periods, because if you're going to judge performance of the princely states or British or anybody, they did get a really raw deal that they got 3 of the worst, rainfall years in our recorded history and 3 deadly pandemics in this period. So it didn't matter whether you're British or a prince or whoever, you had a really tough job on your hands as an administrator. But the proof of doing well is, of course, Europe, where they were concerned about citizens. They did a very good job. They invested in water supply systems. They cut down death rates substantially in UK and Western Europe between, say, 1850 and 1920. Right? So they could have done it if they invested a lot in infrastructure and so on. So hopefully that answers some parts of the question.
Sir, you're on mute. Professor Mohapatra?
Yeah. Nagwant, you want to ask quickly the question?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir, for allowing me. So thank you, Dr. Tumbe. It's a very interesting talk. I have really could not stop myself to engage with you because being a student of early modern history, but I found something methodological confusion in your approach, because the term the age of pandemic is for me, it sounds something like discursiveness to it, because it's defined the age of the phenomenon. But we have seen that there are lots of areas and there are lots of demographical zones that has not been affected, and so how do you because as a student of history, I have been trained that we have multiple narratives. Your approach defines the meta narrative. So how do you, or we popularly known the standpoint theory. So as we have seen that lots of questions are coming to you, and these are not fully and you are explaining to it in a very proper manner. So just I want to say that how these terms, these generic terms, this canonical is what is the scope of other voices to it?
So it's a great question. Firstly, I'll highly recommend you read chapter 1 of my book, where I set this out as to why. Obviously, I'm not concocting just for my own sake. The age of something is the most cliche title of a book, and I try to avoid cliches. But I did this deliberately. This is truly an age of pandemics, a class apart from various other centuries. I write in that first chapter of my book that barring arguably the 6th century CE, 14th century CE, which were plague, years, at no other time in recorded global history have you seen so many deaths as a percentage of global population. All those metrics are there in the first chapter, and that is why this is a unique. We can say disease was always there in history, right? So then everything before 1920 is the age of disease. That's possible, but they were not pandemic diseases, and there's a difference between endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. And pandemic is something which really goes around the world. You're right that 12 million out of 13 million plague deaths happened in India, but plague touched most parts of the world. It reached Brazil, it reached Africa. It did not kill many people, but it still went there. As opposed to malaria, which was endemic in many parts of India and Africa, but it was not there all over the world. There was some disease, typhus, variety of disease, which affected some parts, but they did not spread around the world. That is why we make a distinction between endemic disease, epidemic, and pandemic. You're right on one thing. In the 19th century, they did not use the word pandemic. This is the retrospective. And I am force-fitting a word which came into popular kind of usage in the late 20th century onto something which happened, because the word used by the reports back then was epidemic until influenza came in 1980. But as I said, the words like Mahamari were used, various other words, which are point. Now, the age of pandemics, as I said, is unique for two reasons. One, no other century in the past or in the future, AIDS came closest to it, about 30 million lives lost. But cumulatively speaking, this was devastating. At 70 million people globally. I showed you maps where, yes, not all parts of the world were affected and so on, but most parts of the world did experience it. And so that there is a case I make about generalizability, that is, it was kind of known. Think about how we look at COVID today. Everyone in the world knows the word COVID, right? Everyone knows about COVID. Everyone is experiencing it sometime. That is true about cholera. Cholera, Gabriel Marquez wrote a book, Love in the Time of Cholera. Now, why would a South American writer write about an Indian disease? Is because it was truly global. And that is why you need to kind of talk about this idea that it was not just something endemic to India. It was endemic to Eastern India, but it's a disease which went around the world. And they were conceptualizing, of course, many places based on that. So I use the word age of pandemics precisely because, to the best of my knowledge, no century that we know of as of now before, barring maybe 14th, Black Death century. Even Black Death, the evidence on India is virtually nothing. So it was not really, not really global. So this is truly, and what after 1920 it falls. Death rates, plague is conquered, cholera is conquered, influenza doesn't really come back. There are a few waves, but not so much. And until AIDS strikes, which is a very different kind of transmission, the world is kind of a very different zone until COVID struck. Now this, you might say this is a new age of pandemics. A historian 200 years later can write about that. But my option was here. The other reason I went for this really cliched title is, of course, inspired by Eric Hobsbawm. The Eric Hobsbawm, the trilogy or the 4-volume set, The Age of Empire, Capital.
Age series. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And that's really what popularized this word age. And it is also a response to that Eric Hobsbawm, in all his greatness, he in all those pages, he has about one page on epidemics, right? And it's also kind of a critique of that project that is, look, it's like talking about 2020 without talking about COVID, because this is the larger thing. The day-to-day lives of Indians, I would argue, they were more concerned about not getting plague than not getting the British on a very, very day-to-day basis. Just like we are more concerned about, COVID rather than any larger structures. So it's also a deliberate attempt. And that is why it's very ambitious, type.
Right. I think we have been there for long, and you have answered all the questions very, very well and elaborately. And I think it's a great lesson for students who are becoming academics, also to understand the way Chinmay approaches the problem and also answers questions. This is a real training for us, for our students. Chinmay, thank you so much. Thank you, really, really thank you for, as usual, always lucid and concise, to the point, and sticking to his defending his position strongly without offending anyone, but defending his position. And I would now ask, I think you have some kind of a formal thanks to be given by students. So is there, Abhijit, is that pattern?
No, sir, not really,
okay.
sir.
Just, okay.
Wind up.
Okay, then thank you so much, Chinmay, and we would like to have you for many, many lectures. There are so many questions, so many issues, psychological, economic, and demographic, around the question of pandemic and the question of migration, which I think we should be integrating in our research and course more and more. And you will be, in some sense, a kind of a beacon that we will look to, and we really want to have more interaction with you in the future. I think Seema is there. Seema, Professor Bawa, is she there? I can't make out.
Yeah, ma'am is here.
Okay.
I don't know if
Okay.
she's available right now.
All right.
Right.
Okay, then. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks a lot. And as I said, we do have an internship program for business and economic history. Then if you're working on this, it's a program where you get to spend 2 months pretty much working on your topic. And we have a fantastic library. You get to spend 2 months, and you also get a stipend. So for those 2 months.
Excellent.
So do consider that, and feel free to apply.
And to be around the great staff or great faculty of IIM, including Chinmay. Your director is Errol D'Souza still?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Errol is from JNU. Errol is from JNU. So that
Yes.
is, yeah. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chinmay.
Thank you, Chinmay.
And Chinmay, sorry, is it gone? Yeah. Okay. Okay, then. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. We should end our talk today. And thanks, Razi, and thanks, Abhijit, for organizing it so well. I'm really impressed by the seminar committee's work this time. It's really great. Continue this, and I'll be try my best to come in, even though I watch it from outside. But yeah, it'll be great to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we will be sending the invites for the other future talks via email and also on our Facebook event page. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.